Good morning. This is for CIT 253. It's a 3-credit hour course. This is the week 1 Apache lecture. My name's Charles W. Bill Marshall. You can reach me at cmarshall0050@kctcs.edu or call me on my cell during our office hours. Okay. So you may have heard about Apache, you may have used Apache. What my goal today is to try to give you some background on what this thing you've been using is, how to get it installed on your Windows 10 machine, and then I'm going to expose you to a few lines in the httpd.conf file that you need to use, and many that you may not use, but I want you to understand the power that Apache has. We're installing it on Windows 10, but it also runs on many servers. Okay, it's named after the Indian tribe, or the Native American tribe, and they were famous for their skills in warfare and strategy making. It's a remarkable piece of open source application software with more than 50% share of the commercial web server market. And it's the most widely used web server application in Unix-like operating systems, Unix like OS X, Unix, Linux, FreeBSD, and so forth. But it can also be used on almost all platforms, such as Windows, OS X, Raspberry Pi, and the list goes on. Okay, so we want you to install your Apache server. You're going to install it on a Windows 10 personal computer. If you need to use a different OS, that's highly possible. I will confess to you that I've done and will do all the documentation for the Windows 10 solution, but I run and did all this write-up on a Mac OS. MacBook Pro, so I'm not opposed to, and you can certainly do this on a Mac. You could do it on a Linux, but before you use something other than Windows 10, I want to talk to you mainly because we've got to solve the problem of how I'm going to be able to see your web server when it's on a non-network connected device without DNS and so forth. Okay, here's the link. I'm not going to read it to you, but you can download a copy of this PowerPoint and get it that way. I've tried this and found it to be a very clear and straightforward way to install Apache, PHP, and MySQL, which is the stack we're going to need for this course. But I want you to stop after you do the Apache install this week. We've got a lot to cover this week. I know you're busy. And so we're going to spread the rest of these 2 installs later in the course. So stop after the Apache. Okay, an Apache Web Server, the original configuration file, httpd.conf, it was to define the configuration settings for the HTTP protocol. There was an srm.conf file that configures how the server requests are managed. And there was an access.conf that defined the access controls for the server. The functions were set up by the Apache as they were developing, thinking that you would have server data and security functions. It was essentially arbitrary, and everybody's got to have a plan, and that was theirs. Some administrators still follow that tradition, but the most common for the entire configuration to be defined in the httpd.conf file. Placing the entire configuration in the http.conf is the recommended approach. And the httpd.conf file, which hereafter I'm going to call the conf file, is an ASCII text file that you can use Notepad to view and edit. Or you can use VI if you're on a Linux machine, or something else if you want to. It's basically just an ASCII text file. The comments start with a pound sign. Any line that starts with a pound sign is used only for documentation. Most of the commands in the file are written in a form of a directive followed by the value to be assigned to that directive. In addition to the basic directives, the conf file includes containers that limit the scope of the directives they contain. For example, to limit the certain directives to a specific directory, create a directory container for those directives. We'll see that. There's 5 different types of containers. You have a directory path name, so that it's everything in that directory follows this list of directives. There is a files file name, so that any file that conforms to the file name will follow the directives until you get to the /files that ends it. And you can use wildcards so that you can say *.php if you want all PHP to do something or other. You can also, if the file directive is followed by an optional tilde, sometimes called a squiggly, the file name field is interpreted as a regular expression so that you get all the things that you can do with regular expressions. I first saw regular expressions in Perl, but regular expressions are very powerful for finding what you want. Okay, a location document, it can create a container, and you think, well, what's a location? Why wouldn't that just be a file name? The problem is that a document is made up of many files, and so a location statement that applies only to that specific document, no matter how many different places it got the file from. You can do an if define argument so that if a variable is defined, you can do something. For example, you can say if defined have SSL and end it with the if the slash if defined, and that way you can create values that trigger if you set up a variable. Again, they're trying for flexibility. If a module so that you can say if I've loaded this module, do this, so that simply by putting a module in the command line that you start the server with, you can already have configuration in the HTTP in the conf file that will act appropriately. Directories and files are easy to understand. They're part of the file system that every system administrator knows. But we talked about documents, on the other hand, are specific to a web server. A screen full of information that appears in a response to a web query is a document, but it can come from many files and many different directories. And this way, with a location container, you can make that whole document respond as you want, and as if it's a single entry. Okay, where's the conf file? On our Windows 10, the httpd.conf file is more than 530 lines long. Again, you can see it with Notepad. If you look at one on a Red Hat Linux default version, it's over 1,400 lines long. Both use the same syntax. Now, you can do things with the Red Hat Linux conf file that you can't do with the Windows 10, just because the Red Hat is a server that's set up to do a whole lot more powerful things and designed that way. But the syntax on the Windows 10 uses, the file uses the same syntax. So once you learn it one place, you may be able to do more things where you're going, but you won't be able to do less, or you won't use different syntax. By most of the contents of the file were designed as comments to help you understand. The file is full of comments. If you want to see more and you want to go back to the source, you can go to www.apache.org. Okay, here's a sample of the conf file off of my Windows 10 machine after I did this install. Note, everything here has got a pound sign. So this whole page are just directives that are either there in case somebody wants to use them, but are mostly documentation. The configuration file, one other thing to note here is look at the direction of the slashes on Windows 32. Even because of uniformity, they're still going to use Unix, Linux type directory structure, and so the slashes are going to lay this way as opposed to the classic Windows way of doing it. Configuration file organizes directives by scope. You have global environmental directories, main server directives, and virtual host directives. We're going to talk more about virtual hosts later. We start looking at the conf file with directives that load dynamically loadable modules. These modules must be loaded before the directives because they're how the directives is going to know what to do. Understanding dynamic loadable modules is a good place to start. So, the two directives that appear in most of the httpd.conf file are load module and add module. All the lines and configuration of the dynamic shared object DSO modules are used by the Apache Web Server. You can see the modules that are used with the command httpd -L. And so when I ran it on my machine, I got this answer back. So notice that even though in the httpd.conf file we're using what I think of as forward slashes, in Windows when we're dealing with the command line, we've got backslashes. The http_core.c is the core module, the kernel of the Apache. This is what the whole Apache server uses as its baseline of logic. It's got to have that. mod.so.c provides the runtime support for dynamic shared objects, which is how it's going to add to the http_core.c, and you need to have that also to have any power. Dynamically loaded modules, the two directives are used to enable dynamic loaded modules. First, each module is identified by a load module directive. So you have something like load module, agent log module, the name of the module, and then this is where you can find that module. Where do you get the file for that? The load module directive is followed by the name of the module name and the path to the module itself. So, the module name and the path to the module. In Linux, but not in Windows, the conf file, in addition to the load module, you have an add module directive. This adds the module name to the list of modules that are actually loaded in at runtime. But you don't have to do that in Windows, in the Windows Apache. For example, to add the agent log module to the module list, you would do add module log.c. Again, that doesn't have to be done in Windows Apache. Okay, basic server directives. So, this server admin tells Apache where should it send. When somebody wants to talk to the admin, where should it send them? So notice that we have comments that tell us what it does, and with a line with no comments, we set it to my email address. Server name defines the host name returned to clients when they read data from this server. And it's significant to know that we're not going to worry about that on our Windows 10 machines because we're not using DNS. We're just going to be going to localhost. So you really don't need to set the server name, and so your conf file will look like this, where it's commented out. But if we were using it, you'd have the name that people would be putting in the URL, and then what port number. UseCanonicalName directive. The canonical name directive controls whether the value defined by server name is used. So that if you have somebody, in a lot of my web pages, I don't write the whole web in front of it, the server name in front of it. I'd use relative for the server. But for the user, they want, if you want them to see the whole thing, this use canonical name is how you do it. Again, this is for Linux, not Windows, and it's more to just show you what's available than something you need to do this week. When it's set on, as in Red Hat configuration file, the value is the value of server name is used. When it's off, the value that came in the query from the client is used. If your site uses multiple host names, you may want to set this to off so that the user will see the name that they expect. Or I do that and set it on so that no matter what they keyed in, they get the full name back. ServerRoot. The ServerRoot defines the directory that contains the httpd.conf files. And it's different for the DocumentRoot, which we're going to talk about shortly. The conf directory under the ServerRoot contains the 3 configuration files, and therefore httpd.conf is itself located under the ServerRoot that it defines. So here's an example in mine. I define ServerRoot as, and again note the direction of the slash, and so I just find this variable, and then down here set ServerRoot equal to that variable. The DocumentRoot is different than the ServerRoot because we want to isolate the root of the server from the document, so that even if somebody gets into our system somehow, they're not where they can get to our configuration files. So here's an example where we come down and we talk about the document root being htd docs underneath the server root. And then we set these values. And notice that almost all these are comments except for options index follows symlinks, which we will talk about some other time. But a lot of your httpd.conf file is commented out, but they give you a pattern of how to do it should you want to use different things that are available. Multi-home server configuration. Multi-homed means that you have more than one access to the internet. For example, I worked at Stober and we had Windstream and we had Limestone Cable. We wanted them both so that if one was down, we had a way to service our web, so people could get to our web servers. Listen tells HTTPD, the Apache, which additional addresses and ports should be monitored for the web service. The address and the port pairs are separated by a colon. So here we have the address, colon, and then the port. If a port is entered with no address, the address for the server is used. Bind address tells HTTPD which addresses it should be used for the server interactions. The default value is star, which means that the server should respond to web service requests and addresses to any valid IP address that it has. And this is in Linux only, so again, I'm trying to expose you to things that are in the conf file, but not telling you that you can or should do them on your Windows 10 machine, because you can't. Creating a fancy index. There's all sorts of ways that you can do indexing, and you in fact may want to turn it off so that if you don't have an index.php or HTML or whatever you've got set for your index, you know, when somebody goes to a directory, what file should they read? It's really a good security to make sure that the directories don't work, and you can certainly read about how to do that. But you can ignore an index. You can give a header name to define the name of the file that contains information to be displayed at the top of the directory listing. You can give me a readme name that defines the name of the file that contains information to be displayed at the bottom. You can add icons. You can do a default icon. You can add icon by encoding. Lots of different things that you can do. Not that you need to do them, but I just again want you to know the power that you have of this Apache server. The MIME type files, you're deciding and defining what programs should be used to define different file types. You've got a default type so that if it can't figure out what to do, how should it react? You can add encoding maps so that you can say that if it has a file extension, do this. And I'm going to read all this to you because it's Red Hat, but again, I just want you to know what's available to you. You can add language. You have language priorities. That's if there's multiple solutions, which one should they use? You can add a type of map. You can add handlers. Let's talk about virtual host now. We've talked about multi-honing. Virtual host is when one Apache server runs more than one website, which on Linux boxes is very normal. To use virtual host, you first must uncomment the name virtual host directive. Again, we're not going to do this on Windows 10, but I want you to know how to do it, because as you start running Linux, or I guess Microsoft server level Apache websites, it becomes very useful. The name virtual host directive is commented out, and then next you define the virtual host. Here's an example that they're talking about. If you had a virtual host called www.fish.edu, you'd define where its document root was, you'd tell where its server name was, you'd end that virtual host. Now you'd start talking about the next virtual host of www.mammals.com. You talk about document root, the server name, and virtual host. So what are we going to do with virtual hosts? Why do we care? Well, the first thing is servers typically have power to run, unless you have a heavily loaded website, more than one website. So I have a service virtual machine that I hire, and I think I'm running 5 sites on it right now. That's very typical. One of the sites I run is mcafh.com, and so here's what the entries in its conf file look like. Virtual host, the IP address, and :80. So we're looking at port 80. The server name is mcafh.com, but I'll accept this server alias tells it that it should respond to things to mail.mcaf.com or www.mcafh.com. I do this because nothing galls me more than spend the time to develop a website and a user saying, well, I tried to get there and it's not up. Well, did you put the www in front of it? Oh, no, I never remembered to do that. Well, this means that if they type just the name, or if you put www dot in front of it, the server will respond both. And its document root is home MCAFH public HTML. The server admin, where should we send email from the Apache server to the admin? And then what I've done here is I can put an alias on this mail server so that anything to here is bounced onto my personal account. I do that so that no matter how many different places I have to configure, different daemons are configured, I only have to go to the mcafh.com mail server and put in aliases so that they all come. And if at some point, I retire and somebody else takes over, they don't have to go find all these different places. They can just go to the mail server mcafh.com, change it there, and it's right. And use canonical names off. And there's a lot more stuff, and then the end of it. I also have the real name for the site is marshallcemetery@federalhill.com, which is a lot to type, which is why I got the shorter URL also registered. The virtual host name is the same, but the server name is this long thing. The aliases, it'll take mail marshallcemetery@federalhill.com. It'll respond to marshallcemetery@federalhill.com or www.marshallcemetery@federalhill.com. Or this. This is the real one that the server thinks it's handling, and all these aliases, and the place where I hire the web server to run these wanted to keep this in there so they could remember how it was all hooked together. Notice the document root is the same as the MCAH. So the document root's the same, the IP address is the same, the port is the same. The server admin now, we set where that mail goes, and we still got canonical names off. Because I want, if somebody comes in to MCAFH, I want to give them back the Marshall Cemetery at Federal Hill, or vice versa. The truth is I can't remember which one I give them back, but I'm trying to make it so that there's many different ways to get in as possible. Another way to do it, and this is on the same server because the IP address is the same, the port's the same, is this site is called equipmenthistory.com. The server alias is mailequipmenthistory.com, and so forth. The document root is different. It's a WordPress site. We've got the server admin, the use canonical names, and then a lot more stuff, and so forth. So we've got two reasons to use virtual hosts. One is when you've got several different ways to come into it that you want to have the user work, and then when you have a completely separate site. Resources, and I'm not going to read all these to you because you're going to have a way to get to this PowerPoint, but these are 4 resources that I found that have a lot of detail about how to use the comp files. In fact, this top one is where a lot of the information in this presentation came from. But there's many more files and documents, and the best way is to Google for understanding the Apache httpd.conf file, or however you want to search for it, because using Google as your resource, you stay up to date. Okay. Besides, as part of the demonstration, you have a web page that said it works. In addition, I want you to build this web page, and that's what I'm going to look at when you and I have our web conference, which I hope you will email me and schedule. I think it'll take less than 15 minutes, and we'll do it by GoToMeeting. But I want you to use Notepad to create a file called hello.html. It's going to be this simple. It's probably the simplest HTML file you're ever going to create. and you're going to put it in your DocumentRoot. Now on mine, that's this PC, local disk, Apache 24, HTTP docs. And when I ran it and went to localhost /hello.html, I got hello world. And that demonstrates that you see how to create a truly static page. And when the web started, that's all there was. You could create static pages, and people thought it was really pretty spiffy. What this course is going to do is show you how to do a lot more, put a lot more intelligence, both on the client, which is what we're going to do next week, and back at the host. So that's the end of this CIT 253 3-credit hour lecture, week 1 Apache. Most of this was more for your expanding your horizons to know what you can do. And if you have any questions, please give me a call or email me. And I thank you very much and look forward to our web conference.